this idea. I think what I realized through doing many of my projects that one of the key questions I was always interested in is what you said, which is like, this is what's happening, and is it worth it? Is this a price worth paying for? And then there was always the question of, when you ask who, if it's worth it, you have to ask it for the individual, general society, let's say, or you're also thinking of it in the context of the nation, the state. It's that how they perceive it, because you don't do big projects as a nation without thinking that you're going to get something back out of it for it. But the sacrifice is being felt often by the individuals who live in these locations. And so I think that was the thing that you couldn't see. But what I could document was often what was unfolding.
Welcome back, everybody, to a new episode of Eyeshot 50mm. And today we're sitting down with Ian Teh. Ian is a British Malaysian photographer whose work has examined for more than 3 decades the relationship between economic development, environmental transformation, as well as human life. Together with Eyeshot, we're doing this limited edition book called Undercurrents, Reframed, China 1999-2008, which returns to the archive that defined the beginning of your career, in a way we could say, reinterpreting those photographs from a perspective of the present. Ian, thank you so much for being with me today, and welcome.
Thank you for having me here.
Yes. And just a very small message before we start to everybody who's watching. I just want to remind to keep liking and keep subscribing, because what's a very, very small click to you, it means the world for us. And since a couple of months now, we have all our interviews available as podcast. So Ian, let's actually start with the fun. And the very first thing I want to discuss is your origins, because your relationship with China began not only as a photographic journey, but also as a personal, I guess, investigation into culture, ancestry, and belonging. You were born in Malaysia. You grew up within a Chinese Malaysian cultural background, but later built much of your, let's say, professional life in Britain, if I'm not mistaken. Perfect. Before photography entered your life, how did you see your cultural or understand your cultural identity?
I think I knew very little about my own cultural identity. So there was always a sense of wonder as to what my roots were before Malaysia. So whilst I was very familiar with Malaysian culture, I really had, my grandfather on the paternal side came from China at some point. So it was always shrouded in a sense of mystery. So I didn't really know China at all. And I think throughout the 80s, I grew up watching documentaries from the BBC as China was opening up. And right through to the early 90s. And that kind of caught my attention. So there's always a wonder, like, I wonder what that place is like. And so when photography became a focal point of interest, that was, it almost without me knowing it, that seemed to be a natural point, destination for me to go to for at least that reason and a variety of others.
Because you described traveling through China in the mid-1990s as a decisive experience, if I'm not mistaken. I think I've read this. Yes. What happened during that first journey that made photography, I guess, feel like a possible life?
So there were 2 things. There was the pre-trip and the post-trip, I think, and the actual trip itself. So the pre-trip, I had just finished a course in graphic design. I was very curious, but I was very fascinated by photography and wondered if it could be a way of life for me. So that was the philosophical idea of how the camera could be one with me
Yeah.
in the way I observe the world. But when I went to China, I had a wonderful experience because at that time, I think it was 1995, China was Deng Xiaoping's economic reform policies of opening the country up was kind of in swing. There was a real curiosity for the outside world. So
Yeah.
as a foreigner visiting there, people were incredibly friendly. And of course, you could still see um, many parts of China, like the old China that still existed there. So you could literally see history unfolding. That combination and that experience meant that I ended up traveling for 3 months in that place. And I felt throughout that time that there was a sense of things like China was on the cusp of a major transition. And I didn't know, I was just learning photography. I didn't even know how to make a photo essay, but I felt like I needed to hang around. I needed to come back. And if anything, if I had to learn my skills in China, that's what I would do. So I think it was that sense of commitment to keep wanting
Okay.
to come back that made a big difference.
Okay, because also another very interesting thing about your trajectory, I guess, is that, as we've been said, you did not follow a conventional path of academic trained artists in that sense. So how did you educate your eye? Well, were the experiences, the photo books, the photographers, the artists, not necessarily photography related, that really like shaped your initial visual eye language?
I think the first was the recognition of photographs that spoke to me in the early days. And this was before, this was when I was still in college and I would go to the library because there wasn't an internet then. And I would actually look at books. Quite often they were Magnum photographers or
Sure.
annuals. And I would look at that and certain images used to just capture my imagination. And I was filled with wonder, not only because of the images, but also what I imagined that life might be like. So those were the first things. But I think beyond that, and my initial experiences in China, the next thing that was fundamental in my development were often the conversations I had with people that were my friends. And in some way, we became mentors towards each other. Those conversations were incredibly important. They were like critiques and discussions about our intention, about the photograph,
Yeah.
what it did, and whether it fulfilled those goals that we had in mind. And so those discussions, often informal and through friendships, but sometimes also seeked. So like at that time, I would reach out to professionals in the field, gain their perspective on my work. And those provided insights and were in many ways the foundation of how I kind of developed my eye. I think the last thing I would say, and this was kind of an early recognition and also my decision, because there was always a choice. I could be an intern in a well-known agency or somewhere else. And I was aware of those kind of like paths. But I remember thinking to myself that I don't want to be there. And admittedly, I'll be sacrificing maybe the opportunities to meet people in
Yeah.
these environments. But I don't want to be looking at all these photographs from these great people and not be able to take them myself. I wanted to be on that adventure. And so I decided that what was important was really the time I spent in the field, just kind of crafting my skill. And so the very early years when I started photography, there was long periods of travel to build my skills up. So
It's interesting because like your photography and your method, your editing, your post-production and everything, your photograph often feel like quite quiet and carefully, let's say, controlled, even when they are in situations that are unstable, that emerge from unstable or polluted or rapidly changing environments as well. So behind, I feel like that apparent stillness, there is like a very well structured process of observation, waiting, selection that has been built, and definitely connects to what you've been said so far. And if connecting also to this, I wanted to ask you, when you then arrive in a place, the first thing you do, what is it? What's your approach? Do you research and imagine the photographs in advance, or you let yourself be guided by whatever is the flow that you're in?
Early stages, I would say it was uh, it was a lot messier and organic in the approach.
Yeah,
But it also produced magic in many
absolutely.
ways. But I think what I've realized in hindsight, when I look at some of my best work or work that I consider meaningful, um, I realized that I need a framework, a way to kind of understand what I'm going to do and where I'm going to go. But I always have to leave room for experimentation or for me to look elsewhere rather than some kind of structured, always a structured kind of routine of where and what I plan to do. Those things need to be in place so that I am in a way anchored in some way and maintain my sanity. But the second part is I need room for experimentation. Um, and interestingly, I always felt that photography was incredibly difficult in some ways. And what I mean by that is you can spend a whole day trying to look for a picture, and most of your day is actually quite boring until you have a magic 10 minutes where something happens and you kind of wait for that. And the trick sometimes is being patient enough to know that all of everything else that's part of the whole process, and kind of
Yeah.
to be at one with it, which I never was for a long time. But I recognize that I think it was a very important part of the process to do that, you know.
The
So
early beginnings. Yeah.
yeah, and you have to kind of like trust the process, which is hard to do at the beginning,
So hard.
but
Yeah.
later on you realize that the boredom allows you to reflect on how you want to approach your project. The the pre It allows you to adjust your perception of the subject matter that you're working on, um, because you're now in the field and the information is coming at you, and you have to adapt to your understanding to what you're trying to photograph.
And in terms of post production, what role does post production play in your work? And how do you decide when an adjustment is needed or not?
So post production is an important role, but it's what I used to do in the darkroom when I was shooting black and white.
Yeah.
All of those tools are what I use in the Lightroom. So in the sense that, you know, my traditional skills of printing, dodging and burning, all of those things that you do. So I always kind of feel like a photograph, what you compose and what you capture is essentially um, a rough sentence, but the actual um, work that you do on the print is kind of like the copy editing that you do to a sentence to bring precision to where you want the attention to be forefronted, and what is perhaps less important. And you do that maybe in the English language, you might put the first few words and the last few words are the key important words that leave an impression, more of an impression. And with the photograph, it's through dodging and burning, where you want to, how you compose the light you use and how you bring that up becomes part of that process of creating that sentence that you want to develop.
There is one thing that I really, really liked that I read as well, is that you have compared your photographic project to a small films made from still images. First of all, what do you mean by that and why? I would love for you to explain it as well. And what can sequencing then express that an individual photograph cannot? I'm leaving it like that.
Yeah. No, good. It's a good one. So one of the things that I felt really frustrated with still photography was that was the sense of time. You can't, in movies, you can put the end at the beginning. You can basically chop up time
Yes.
or chronology in multiple different ways. And I love that about film. And I love that how you can show different perspectives in the process through the way you edit a movie or film. But with photography, there isn't that. And if there is, it's not very clear. So a lot of my early work was really trying to explore this idea of how could I work with almost different threads. So sometimes it would be, and that caused me to explore things in the way I choose to photograph. So in terms of like the way I use colors. So I almost imagine them to be these multiple threads of different narratives that were going on when I sequence my work together to kind of create these different narrative threads, if you want. And it might be characterized by color
Yeah.
and form and the way I compose the work, etc. And so Undercurrents became these different short stories as a result of that. But also in my later work, I would try to combine that into one story, let's say, but be approaching the work fundamentally in two different ways in the same story in order to create almost two different types of narrative that ran alongside each other. And those experiments, I mean, I really enjoyed the process because it was something that was frustrating me creatively, but at the same time, because there was that frustration, it forced me to kind of work towards finding a satisfactory creative solution to these things that I enjoyed in movies.
Okay, cool. Because that's exactly what stayed with me, and I'm glad that you have explained it as well, and it's very interesting. Now, instead, changing gears a little bit, I want to discuss your period between 1999 and 2008, because you traveled extensively through China during one of the most, I guess, important as well as dramatic, I guess, periods of transformations in the country as well, both on the social and economic level as well. So when you returned to China in 1999, did you already know what you wanted to photograph, or did the project kind of reveal itself while you were doing it?
I knew what I wanted to do for my specific project, but I didn't know that that specific project would form one of the stories to Undercurrents, is the short answer.
Okay.
I was largely following my nose. These were the projects or the stories that I was interested in were things that caught my attention and I wanted to document and explore. But the subsequent returning to expand on these stories and the discovery of new stories that I wanted to work on meant that I eventually started to see similarities or things that connected what I was observing among these various stories as an overarching kind of themes that I started noticing throughout China.
Exactly. And connecting to these themes, because China is really not presented through, let's say, official symbols or major historical events. It emerged from bars, workers, daily life, provincial towns, industrial spaces, of course, and everything like that. So what were the themes that you started noticing, I guess, that were developing within this project?
I think, for example, when I worked on like the Three Gorges Dam, so that series is called The Vanishing, and when I looked at how that massive transformation over 700 kilometers of river, um, where a total of something like 1,000 villages, towns, and cities were destroyed and submerged in order to displace some 1.4 million people. What I noticed that all of that was happening was done often through the hands of migrant workers. Um, and then the other thing that obviously was apparent was the scale, and that this was something that was going to be repeated throughout many endeavors that China was doing, whether it's in the coal industry or the industrialization process, everything was at scale, but often built through by migrant workers, people who were originally farmers, but
Yeah.
migrated to find basically better opportunities by doing work in the booming economy. And quite often it would be more dangerous, or it would be far away from where their homelands were. So that was a very common theme. Um, yeah, and I think in Dark Clouds it was not only migrant workers, but also it was the the abundance of, let's say, coal as an energy that was there. So all of these things, yeah, made me feel like there was always these key repetitive things that were recurring in the story that was unfolding in China at that time.
Because in your work, I feel like a central question concerns what societies desire from progress and what they prepared to sacrifice in order to achieve it some ways. So the question I have for you is because it starts from the fact that your work is often described about being about the environmental cost of development, but it also contains ambition, desires, and every kind of like those emotions and hope as well, I feel. How do you photograph progress without either celebrating it or condemning it too easily? Condemning too easily. Yeah.
Uh, a good question. It's hard.
It's hard, right? Yes,
Yeah,
because
yeah,
sometimes it's not always like it depends. I will let you
yeah,
the floor actually.
yeah. No, and I think those ideas didn't come to me immediately. This idea, I think what I realized through doing many of my projects that one of the key questions I was always interested in is what you said, which is like, this is what's happening, and is it worth it? Is this a price worth paying for? And and then there was always the question of, when you ask who, if it's worth it, you have to ask it for the individual, general
Yeah.
society, let's say, or you're also thinking of it in the context of the nation, the state. It's that how they perceive it, because you don't do big projects as a nation without thinking that you're going to get something back out of it for it.
Yeah.
But the sacrifice is being felt often by the individuals who live in these locations. And so I think that was the thing that you couldn't see. But what I could document was often what was unfolding. But what I could also do was be conscious about how I documented and framed my images, and how I sequenced and told that story, so that I left enough room so that these questions or these considerations can be suggested to the viewer, you know. So if you took Dark Clouds, for example, which was looking very much at the coal industry, I felt in the early stages of doing the work, I really felt like my first trip was an absolute failure, because I thought this was such a visual subject
Hmm.
that I could not fail, because images would just
Come
turn
out.
up in front. Yeah,
Yeah.
they would just come out of me when I turn up to these places. I later realized, after I finished that trip, I was incredibly disappointed. I didn't even want to look at my contact sheets for months later, because I felt it was a failure. But it then dawned on me on my second trip that what I was interested of the things, what drew me to this? What were the fundamental questions that drew me to, let's say, the subject? And what came out was this idea that you have one of the biggest things that are happening in the country, which is essentially you're trying to create energy to build, let's say, the factories and the products that are going out to the rest of the world. And I was going to the source of that place. Many of these places were the sources of that place. And you felt like on that scale, you could see the national dream. But when you look at it on a smaller scale to the individual, I recognized that every single person who was working in these spaces were also pursuing a dream, their dream of not being a farmer, but to improve their life. And because of that sense of hope, they were prepared to sacrifice maybe their safety, being away from their family for a whole year in a faraway land within their country to do all of this stuff. So it felt like what I was witnessing was a giant machine. And that the people who were within that were cogs. And that, in many ways, formulated the way I would approach the visuals. I at one point started to creatively visualize myself as a worker in these spaces. And I wanted the scenes that I was witnessing, the industrial landscape, to be overwhelming in the way it was larger than life. And that was how I approached it. I also wanted people to feel small. And so even though I had many great pictures that I really loved, the final edit that I did in Dark Clouds was one where you hardly saw any faces. They were either silhouettes, small figures, or they were in some ways reflected. So it's almost like you weren't seeing the real person. And that in its way anonymized the individual, because I was trying to forefront the machine. And then through portraits, I was trying to then give the individual recognition at that point. That's the only time I gave them recognition, was a portrait, to say, here's this person and here's what they do. And in many ways, they are a container for their own individual dreams, and they represent the many individuals that are working within this space. So how I edited and sequenced that through portraits, etc., was my way of trying to work with these different narrative threads that I was trying to build in, that wasn't explicit, but was very much part of the consideration of the edit and sequencing of the work.
And after having said all of this, also the social and the individual relationships and the dreams of these people, do you think documentary photography sometimes can create, let's call it like a false moral distance, allowing like viewers to condemn the systems in which they are themselves involved, if that makes sense?
I think based on what you see from the photographs of other people's work, etc., people form judgments, and some of that, you're asking if whether some of that is, can be false, or it can be kind of unintended interpretations of the work. And I think over time, I feel like as a creator, or as an observer and as a creator, I realized that you are only 50% of that equation. The other 50% is basically the viewer and what their experiences and their past life experiences come from that. So there's these there's this dialogue that's happening between what's been witnessed and also the viewer perception of what they see. And a photograph without a caption, in many ways, provides you so little information. So I think, yes, you're right, that the photograph, any photograph, can leave plenty of room for misinterpretation, or just or if you want to maybe look at it in a more beautiful way, for
Yeah.
multiple interpretations. I think that's the thing I realized quite early on about photography, and that's why I love photography, is that it is a language that is strongest at leaving room for reflection and a
Okay.
variety of interpretations. That doesn't mean that any of those reflections are necessarily conclusive, but what it does for the viewer, I feel, if you really engage with the photograph and the body of work, is pause, reflection, and therefore multiple thoughts and processes can happen in that process and through your own experience and the interpretations that you come from there and the meaning that you're trying to extract from, let's say, the author, etc. That is where its value is, I feel, not in providing a conclusive proof. I mean, there's other ways of photographing with that intention in mind, but for me, the kind of photography I love, it's what I just described.
And pushing this thought forward, photography records, let's say, visible surfaces, while many of the processes that you have addressed, climate change, globalization, displacement, progress, and everything, are complex and, let's say, partially invisible, we could say. What can a photograph prove, and where does instead its evidential power end?
What can a photograph prove, and where does its evidential power end?
Yes, in documentary photography, of course. Then there are different genres where in documentary photography. I'm not saying that beauty is not part of documentary photography. Sometimes it's also necessary. Sometimes maybe not, and there is the risk of kind of like beautify something that's not
Yeah,
so
yeah.
beautiful.
I think there's always everything that you're mentioning is something that's it's a conversation that's been going on for a very long time in photography, documentary photography itself, and it's kind of what makes it interesting in many ways. But I also think that if you're asking what it can prove, I think if your intention is to create proof, then your approach will be fundamentally quite different
Different.
also.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
and I think if what you're trying to tell, and in my case is I'm trying to document, as in provide a record on one level, but
Yeah.
I also see myself as an author, a visual author that's trying to use this process to communicate, but also through the process of communicating and discovery to understand issues that I myself, as a layperson, is struggling to understand. And so, in that sense, the photographic process is not is one part proof on one level, but you can't say it's conclusive in any way. But on another level, um, it's an interrogation into a subject, and in many ways the beneficiary is the author because they're in there and they're most invested in that process, and that's the other journey. But through that process, what you communicate and produce is, for my purposes, is to provide open pictures
Yeah.
where people can travel within it beyond the boundaries of the moment it was photographed and beyond the boundaries of the frame that it was taken. And you can argue that many other photographs can do that, but essentially I come to that with that purpose. There's a documentary aspect of it, and as well as this other facet that I find really interesting. And I feel like, yeah, you can't, if proof was your sole purpose, you would approach photography very differently. As in the case of, like, let's say, a crime scene photographer, let's say, if you wanted
Yeah.
to really bring it down to that level.
Okay. Okay. That's very, very interesting. And when you look and when you depict, because then then there is the role of the photographer. When you depict people or portray people that are being affected by environmental issues such as that one or transformation industry and everything, what kind of responsibility do you feel you have towards the subjects you're shooting in this delicate, let's say, situations?
I think for myself, I've admired many photographers who work on the micro level. And when I say micro
Mm-hmm.
level, I mean is they become incredibly intimate with their subjects. Um, I realized very early on I was not that kind of photographer, even though it was something I could access, because I could never come to terms with, I struggled to come to terms with the ethical issues
Yeah.
that I was having with the way I was working, and I didn't, in some ways, trust myself. That's and that these were decisions I made quite early on, and it's one of the reasons why I choose to focus on the epic and the larger scale because of things, whether it's um, using a camera that allows high volume of pictures like a 35mm camera or a larger format camera. My interest is really like looking at the workings of what I'm observing on a societal level and those problems that there. So, in answer to your question, I would say is I think there's many issues that are connected to that, and
Yeah.
the way I've chosen to navigate through that is to work on the bigger picture rather than go too intimate onto that single person or the single family that I'm working in, because yeah, it's something that I struggle with, I would say.
That's perfect. That definitely closes it perfectly. Now I want to change gears quite a lot while still staying on the topic. And I want to talk about the book, this limited edition book we're doing together. And almost 30 years, I guess, after these photographs were made, with this version of Undercurrents, we're returning to that work, as we have been said so far. And rather than reproducing the original publications, we're going into separate ways. The very first thing I want to mention is that Undercurrents, the title, suggests this hidden movements beneath the visible surface. What were the undercurrents you felt in China at the time? And could you explain how you see this work to the people who are watching?
So yeah, you summed it up very well.
Damn it.
So what can I add to it? I think basically the visible surface, the things that I was observing were in a way this layer that encouraged you to want to understand and look deeper, because on the surface, what we saw was an economic miracle. Um, it was a giant engine that was, the country was going through a transition, and it was mobilizing huge sections of society or all sections of society in the process. But in that, I felt like in so many of my works, that the stories that I was looking at, I was fundamentally interested in the cost and the price that was happening, because the point and those years I was working in there, I can say is probably it was the peak of transformation in terms of industrialization. And what I saw on the ground made me pause, because you could see the environmental and the societal impact it was having in a negative sense to in those areas, and the scale of it. But on another level, you could also see this incredible benefit that was coming out, and the elevation of 800 million people that was brought out of poverty in the process. At that time, I didn't know that figure, but post that period, you see that.
Yeah.
So that question was forefront in my mind, and the undercurrents that you're referring to were all of these things that I never knew or wondered, will there be a time that will I be able to see it in my lifetime that those questions could be answered? And, would it take decades before you actually see the results of that, of the fruits of this labor that was being conducted on a national basis and at probably the largest scale that the world has ever seen.
And working on this book also meant looking again at photographs made by a much younger, pass me the term, version of yourself. And did you ever find yourself disagreeing with the photographer of the time now, if that makes sense?
Well, I'm still in that journey right now.
Yeah, fair.
So I would say I am wondering if I'm going to have many disagreements with myself in that regard. I know that the way I chose to shoot many of my projects meant that while you can't help but maintain your individual DNA or stamp that exists in your photographs and in your stories, I did consciously work quite differently as much as I was able, because I wanted to approach each story with intent rather than with you can say a house style or whatever, like with a particular one size fits all approach. So that meant that I needed to vary it. The problem with that comes with how do you put all of this together? And that's a mental challenge that I'm still having a conversation with, but I'm very excited to be in this process, because it's something that, when you approached me about this idea, I thought, wow, someone has just knocked on my door, something I've been thinking of for a long time. So thank you.
Oh, no, thank you. I have another question, because looking at this photograph in 2026, do they feel like documents of a disappearing world, or documents of, or the beginning, not documents, or the beginning of the world we inhabit instead today? I have my perspective.
I'm sure you do. I feel like it's another planet, to be honest. I feel like my photographs show an era that feel like they're even further away than the years suggest. That's how I feel about it. The China that I hear about or have seen even in my last trips is so different now, and materially so much more advanced. But I feel like so in that sense it does feel like, some of the places I went to had donkey carts to cart coal around, and that was a common sight. So they are literally worlds apart in that sense. But I would say though that period of time had a huge sense of hope and optimism as well, despite all the hardships that I was witnessing.
When you began photographing China, many of the transformations you encountered were, let's say, barely visible internationally, speaking internationally. Today, instead, we live within an environment of such like stream of images. It's so easy to photograph and share, sharing thoughts and everything like that. Has then greater visibility produced greater understanding, or has our inability to sustain attention became the real problem?
I think the latter.
The latter, yeah, fair enough.
For sure. I feel like I think the technologies that we have now allow us to disseminate work and get more eyeballs on this works. Yeah. But I feel like also sometimes the interest and the attention is also short-lived in the process. So I think Short answer is the latter, yes.
Okay, perfect. Just a couple of more questions, and then I swear I let you go. I let you free. Absolutely. I wanted to ask you, after more than 30 years photographing change, what have you learned to distrust about the appearance of progress?
Ah, distrust. That's a heavy word. I'm not so sure I would use that word. I think more along the lines of complexity.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah.
Um, and it depends which way you look at it. And I think also, no, I mean, this is a question I have myself, and I don't think I have one that I have an absolute answer to.
Sure.
And I think the answers that I have tend to shift depending on, what I've observed and situations, etc.
Yeah.
But I think complexity is a big one. Sorry. And the second thing is, I think if I took the case of China, let's say, the material benefit that China has gained over the last that decade that I documented it is unquestionable. So you can say materially it's worth it. But at the same time, in the society that exists right now in China, I also noticed that there's a much higher level of migration of Chinese nationals leaving the country, for example. So that suggests, you know, a whole bunch of new challenges that the
Yeah.
society is facing there. So that dream of progress, while having in some way materially attained it, has created a whole set of different other problems as well. And that because what we're observing is not necessarily conducted in a laboratory, then you can't pin things down absolutely to understand what causes what. But I think that's what I mean by complexity. So it's a question that I feel like, we move so fast forward, and whatever China is experiencing, we as societies have obviously experienced it in other countries as well at different times, that level of progress. So the question comes is like, we save more time, we improve our quality of lives, we produce technology that saves time, but
Yeah.
somehow we feel like even more under pressure in the process. So what does that tell us about, progress? Or
Exactly.
is it more about something that we need to look at in ourselves and the way we approach life, the world, etc. So yeah, that's why I struggle to answer that. But I think if that's an answer, that's kind of
Yes.
where I stand with
That,
that.
that's what that was exactly was what I was looking for. Ian, I thank you so, so much for being with me today. And I hope I made you feel comfortable. I felt super comfortable, and it was very, very interesting to talk to you. So thank you so, so much.
It was a pleasure, and thank you to you too and your team. It was, yeah, it's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Great. Thank you so much. And just a very small message before we conclude. I just want to remind everybody who's watching to keep liking and keep subscribing. And until September 30th, Ian's limited edition book with Eyeshot will be available for pre-order. And after that, it will never be reprinted or restocked again. Ian, once again, thank you, and talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucrezia.